Throughout much of Canada's history, the two major railway companies were Canadian National, or CN, and Canadian Pacific, or CPR. CN represented itself with a maple leaf, while CPR used a beaver. This was until 1960, when CN completely rebranded itself with an innovative and modern look, led by Alan Fleming. I delve more into CN's rebranding in this video of mine, so go take a look if you're interested or want some more backstory. This new appearance impressed the public, who are now seeing Canada's railways as looking old and outdated. But this still left Canadian Pacific, CN's rival, behind in the evolving world of railroad graphic design. So how did Canadian Pacific go from this logo in 1886 to this one in 2017? Here's how that happened. Canadian Pacific's transcontinental route was completed on November 7, 1885, with the first train leaving Montreal and Toronto on June 28, 1886. An appealing timetable design was needed with an iconic look, so printers looked through their stock of standard printer's block logos and came up with a spade-shaped shield, a rather ornate and Victorian look. Using the shield, the name Canadian Pacific Railway was placed on top. However, apart from the name Canadian, it didn't really quite resonate enough with Canada's cultural identity. At the end of 1886, the CPR's passenger department decided on a beaver, a common and important animal native to Canada. The beaver was placed atop the shield, giving it a tree branch with maple leaves to gnaw on. The beaver and maple leaf would soon be adopted as Canada's national symbols. Two other variations would be developed in the 1890s, now adding the color red, but becoming more simplified in design. This would become CPR's primary image on printed materials, but locomotives and rolling stock use simple lettering as identification. Towards the end of the Great War, later known as World War I, Canadian Pacific's art department found itself tired of the Victorian-influenced designs and began experimenting with the railway's logo. The existing shield and beaver would be encapsulated in a circle, a logo shape becoming popular with railroads at the time. The new logo sported the railway's name circling the old logo, now in full color. This logo was also used as part of an employee incentive program. It allowed selected locomotive engineers with long-standing accident-free records to put their name within the circle around the beaver shield. The engineer's personalized logo would then be placed onto their assigned steam locomotive. However, the 1890s beaver shield would still be used on timetables. By the 1920s, Canadian Pacific Railway was an international name with steamship lines to Europe and Asia. Another new logo was made to reflect this. In 1929, the shield returned with bright colors and the slogan, "World's Greatest Travel System." The railway lines lettering could be interchanged for CPR's other business ventures like hotels, ships, telegraphy, and trucking. The iconic beaver, however, was out to lunch and didn't appear in this design. But with Canadian Pacific's rising global influence, yet another new logo would be made to fit this change. This also brought about the return of an old friend. In 1946, CPR unveiled a new and iconic logo. The shield was once again utilized, with our good friend the beaver returning as well. A simplified red, yellow, and white color scheme and a white outline were established as the beaver grips a tree branch. For the first time, a script-style font was used for the railway's name, compared to the sans serif or serif fonts used previously. Finally, a globe resides at the bottom with the slogan, "Spans the world," within it. This version was used until 1949 when the globe and outline were dropped, and the lettering changed to white. Meanwhile, some steam locomotives, notably the Royal Hudsons and new diesel locomotives, were making use of a maroon, yellow, and gray paint scheme. Most steam locomotives had serif-style lettering on the tenders, while diesels, but also some steam engines, used the railway's logo as identification. This logo would be used on all things Canadian Pacific, ranging from locomotives, timetables, and trucks. CPR would dieselize by November 1960, and it was around this time that some visual changes for the railway would begin. The beaver shield was slightly modified with darker colors on the beaver, and the script-style font was simplified to be more readable. Rolling stock was starting to change too. Newsprint boxcars were colored green and given a unique pine tree logo by around 1966. Insulated heated boxcars were painted yellow, reefers were silver, along with some cabooses now having new bright red paint with yellow ends. Despite these changes, CPR still looked rather vintage compared to their competitor, Canadian National, who had just rebranded essentially everything about themselves. Canadian Pacific was going to need to do a lot more to keep up with the times. In 1967, Canadian Pacific President Ian D. Sinclair hired the skilled New York-based marketing firm Lippincott and Margulies to reevaluate the railway's image. After a year's worth of work, Lippincott and Margulies developed the Multimark, and Canadian Pacific Railway was given a new name, CP Rail, utilizing the increasingly popular font Helvetica. The logo was a radical departure from previous designs, now featuring a triangle to convey the railway's goal of always moving forward, a semicircle to symbolize a global reach, and a square to represent corporate stability. Similar to CN's new logo, CP Rail's new logo contained no drawings or images like the beaver to provide a more timeless and modern look. As the name implies, the Multimark served multiple purposes. It was used on the company's non-railway business ventures like air transport, shipping, trucking, hotels, and telecommunications. These were all color-coded to better represent each division. CP Rail also introduced a new paint scheme for their equipment. Locomotives were now painted a bright red, known as Action Red, with white stripes on the nose and black and white stripes on the rear. The Multimark would be applied to the rear sides of engines at varying sizes, depending on the locomotive model. Now, a story is that the locomotives were originally supposed to be painted black with a red Multimark, but when Canadian Pacific was presented with the design, CPR said, "We paid you $500,000 to come up with black?" Anyway, rolling stock would also be color-coded. General service boxcars, stock cars, gondolas, and flat cars were red. Newsprint boxcars were action green. Insulated boxcars were yellow. Reefer cars were silver. Specialty cars like autoracks, hoppers, and tank cars were black. And cabooses were yellow. Passenger cars and RDCs were given a red stripe band with CP Rail and the Multimark on the side. All of this would be officially unveiled on June 17, 1968. A display train was also ran to showcase the new branding. It was the modern boost Canadian Pacific needed to their image to keep up with the times. Gradually, all the new locomotives and other equipment and materials were given the new look throughout the 1970s and 80s. CP Rail had become known for their flashy action red paint paired with candy cane stripes. Around 1979, the Multimark saw an unofficial change. Painting the logo over the grills of locomotives could be tedious. Thus, CP Rail's Ogden shops in Calgary, Alberta created a small version of the Multimark that stopped below the grills. This went unnoticed for a while until company officials noticed, and they were said to be less than pleased with the unofficial change. However, they realized it was cheaper to paint a smaller logo, so they just went along with it. Okay! By the 1980s, the Multimark was given the nickname Pac-Man, after its resemblance to the character from the popular 1980 arcade game of the same name. But despite the success of CP Rail's new image, the Multimark would be retired after only 19 years. By 1987, Canadian Pacific's non-railway divisions were being restructured and renamed, and according to CP Rail, had lessened the effectiveness of the Multimark. The Multimark logo was quietly removed, and the Helvetica-based CP Rail was now the company's logo as a wordmark. Locomotives were now painted in a solid dark red color, and the railway's initials largely bolded on the nose instead of the candy cane stripes. In April 1990, the Soo Line Railroad was now fully controlled by CP Rail. The word system was then added to better represent the expanded scope of the railway. CP Rail's acquisition of the bankrupted Delaware and Hudson Railway in January 1991 brought in more American markets for the company, so a Canadian-American flag was added to the wordmark logo in 1993. This was used until 1997, when once again, a familiar face would return. In July 1996, as part of a corporate reorganization, the Canadian Pacific Railway Company became a subsidiary of Canadian Pacific Limited, a company created in 1971 to manage properties and divisions owned by CP Rail. This brought back the Railway Division, or CP Rail's, former original name after 28 years. To reflect this return to form in 1997, Canadian Pacific embarked on a minor rebranding. A vintage-esque logo was created, with a golden beaver and the original CPR shield and maple leaf being the spotlight. The company's date of formation in 1881 was also included. Bank Gothic was used as the railway's new typeface. On locomotives, the new logo was decaled on the side with the company initials on the nose. In 2007, the logo was modified to remove the well-received beaver. once again, and omitted the word railway to take advantage of diverse opportunities outside the rail industry. This was used until 2012, when Canadian Pacific simplified once again and simply made their logo CP, using the existing typeface. Locomotives retained the Bank Gothic Canadian Pacific lettering. The change was just more of a corporate decision. But once again, our good friend the Beaver, for the third time, came back for the company and on the side of locomotives. In February 2017, Canadian Pacific announced another return to form for the railway by bringing back the 1997 logo with a simplified, bolder appearance. AC 4400CW number 9835 and 8639 first received this treatment in July 2017, with subsequent engines like the SD70 ACUs seeing the Beaver return as well. Canadian Pacific said the new logo renews Canadians and the employees' sense of pride in the company that connected a nation and that connected a nation with the rest of the world. The logo uses two of Canada's national symbols, the beaver and maple leaf. It's a modernization of a classic logo that's recognized as helping build and connect Canada. And given its symbolism, it's very clearly a Canadian logo. Special interest in promotional locomotives have also since received variations of the beaver shield, and some locomotives even returning to the classic maroon paint scheme. Canadian Pacific Railway has truly come full circle in their company appearance. The company has gone through plenty of change in its 140-year history, but has been able to recognize its heritage and see a true return to form. From a beaver and shield to the iconic geometric multimark, a Helvetica wordmark, and soon enough a return to form with the beaver and shield and a modern typeface, Canadian Pacific has managed to keep up with the times in an ever-changing graphic design world. While some locomotives are still painted in their now faded multimark scheme, it reminds people of how the railway has changed. With the Canadian Pacific Kansas City Southern Railway merger still in talks as of the making of this video, if it goes through, it will surely bring about a new logo and company appearance. Regardless, the Canadian Pacific Railway, much like Canadian National, has truly been an icon of Canadian graphic design.